What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. We're out here in the garage embracing the cold to try and finish up the rest of our teardown for the off season this year. There's not really a whole lot left for us to do. All I really want to do is pull the radiator, the drive shaft, and check our rear end to make sure that it's still straight enough to do what we need it to do. The only thing that happened during our ownership so far that I'm slightly concerned with is just that little bit of contact we had during that last race on our left rear that ultimately knocked our rear fender off, but it was wheel to wheel, so I do want to make sure that the long side of our rear end is still relatively straight enough to easily pull the axle out and put it back in and all that stuff. So that's really the only way that we're going to check it. We don't have a jig or anything like that to put the rear end on to make sure it's square, but we also don't really want to spend the money right now to get a new one if we don't have to. But if it is bent, we probably will, and send this one off to get straightened up for us just so that we have a spare. Now, I've actually already decided that we're going to leave the motor in the car. All we're going to do is go through and replace the motor mount bolts that are attached to it, and anything that's attaching the motor mounts to the motor, we'll probably replace those bolts as well. But for the most part, we're going to leave the motor in the car. There's no reason for us to pull it if we're not going to send it off and get it rebuilt or anything like that. And ideally, we shouldn't need to replace the wiring harness at all or any part of it, since this is a brand new harness that only has 4 or 5 races on it. So hopefully there's nothing on the harness that needs to be replaced. I know that there's a couple of connections on here that are at weird angles that do need to be replaced occasionally because they're just not made the proper way, but we're hoping that the harness right now is good enough to continue to run the car. We will eventually go through and change out the spark plugs, but that's not going to be in this video. Our main focus is to just get the radiator off, clean up the connection points for the hoses, and really just try and pull the axles out of the rear end, check the drums, check the brake shoes back here, make sure that they're still good. But I do still want to pull the axles out just to make sure that the rear end is relatively straight. We'll also make sure to do a fluid swap before we take the car out on the track. Obviously, we'll change the oil and all that stuff and fill the car up with some water, but that's not going to be right now or anytime soon. And then I do want to pull the drive shaft off just to take a look at it, make sure our U-joints are good and not blowing out, get everything re-greased up. We'll probably replace the bolts that connect the front yoke to the motor right here, just to be safe. And we'll also obviously replace those lock washers. For those of you who remember, our last race in the 1250 car ended early because our front drive shaft bolt started backing out, causing a severe vibration, and that vibration ended up causing a bolt to back out on our rear end that connected the upper bar to it. So that's definitely something we're going to try to avoid this year. That was added to our double check list just to make sure that that's something that we check and recheck every time right before we go on track. And now that's even something that we check while we're at the track just to make sure that it doesn't randomly back out on us while we're there. So we're definitely getting a list together of all the maintenance stuff we need to do every single week. You know, it's one of those things where we don't always know what's going to happen until it happens, and sometimes we just got to learn the lessons. But for now, I really want to focus on getting the rest of this car apart so we can start putting it back together. So to start, we ended up pulling our bumper off here off of the front of the car because this will give us a little bit more room so we can continue our work on the radiator. We removed the top bolt, which surprisingly we actually have. I know a majority of the people don't have the top bolt on these radiators. And then we pulled the 2 side bolts securing the radiator to the chassis. We tried pulling the small hose off of the top, but unfortunately it seems like it was frozen on, and we tried hitting it with a heat gun but didn't want to waste too much time on it, so we ended up skipping that for now and getting started on the rear end here. The main thing we want to look at is to see if these brake shoes are in decent shape, make sure the wear is pretty even on them. The brake drums looked pretty good, there was no grooving or anything, so I think we're going to run these brakes again for next year. After determining the brakes were good, we moved on to pulling the axles here because this is the side that we had that small bit of contact we talked about earlier. One thing we want to make sure is that this axle is still relatively easy to pull out by hand. Make sure we don't need any additional tools to pull it out, because if it's more difficult and you need that external force, it's more than likely your rear end is bent. But luckily for us, our axle pulled straight out. Everything on the inside looked good. The splines on the gear looked good. Splines on the axle looked good. The seal looked nice and round. It wasn't oblong or anything, so we just did our quick little inspection, put our axle right back in, pushed it in a little bit, and tightened the bolts right back on so that we can move over to the other side. Now moving over to the right side here, it's much of the same as the left side. Our brake shoes were unfortunately covered in gear oil from the gear fluid leak we had during the Legend Invasion, but we'll do a little bit of a better job to clean that up with some brake clean here, because these shoes have plenty of life and the brake drums look just as fine as the other side. So we will continue to use these brakes for next year. After looking at the brakes, we decide to pull the axle again, take a look at the seal. Make sure you don't accidentally drop your axle on the seal, because that will put a dent in the seal and it'll cause it to leak and ultimately have to force you to replace the seal or drive with gear fluid all over your brakes, which is definitely not ideal. But once we determined everything was good on this side as it was the left side, we started pushing the axle right back in, and like I said, it's a little bit easier because of the shortened length, but it still takes a little bit of time to get the axle in right. And we'll go ahead and tighten up these bolts, get the drum back on, and tighten down the lug nuts. Now since we were already back here working to finish up the right rear, I figured we might as well work on unbolting the rear of the drive shaft here. It's not too bad. It's just 4 bolts that go through to a nut, typically a nylock nut with the nylon insert. But these are usually bolts that I like to pull and replace every year, and replace the nuts even if they don't look like they need to. And then on the front here, you don't really have much options, but we also replace these bolts every year. And now that we know that these can back out pretty frequently, we're going to start replacing our lock washers every now and then, and definitely make sure to double check this every weekend to make sure that all 4 of these bolts are nice and tight, so that they won't back out from the vibration of the drive shaft. And this is also where I'll bring up that for us, we'll go through and send our drive shaft off to a professional to have them balance it and make sure it's good to go, so that there's no oscillating vibrations or anything, since it is a rotational force and it does get up to a pretty decent RPM that can cause some oscillation. So definitely something we try to get ahead of, and we'll hopefully not make the mistake of losing bolts next year. And that's pretty much everything I really wanted to make sure we get to when it comes to tearing down the car. Unfortunately, we weren't able to check out the radiator too much because we have a hose right here that goes towards the top of the block that unfortunately seems to have some residue here on the nipple fitting, and ultimately seems frozen to the pipe, so we weren't able to remove that off of the radiator. But we went through the rear end, pulled both axles out. Both of them came out pretty easily, so I'm assuming our rear end is straight right now. We tried our best to keep them off the seals, but we won't know if they're leaking until we get the car out on a track and do a shakedown. Both pairs of shoes and brake drums in the rear seem pretty okay. We just need to scuff up the shoes on both sides, since the right side for sure had quite a bit of gear fluid on it from when it had the leak, and I didn't clean it off super well. So we definitely got to scuff up those shoes quite a bit, get those drums cleaned out with some brake clean. And you know, none of those brake drums showed any signs of grooving or uneven wear, and the shoes looked fine. So we're gonna try and run those again for next year. We didn't bleed them or adjust them right now because the temperatures are so low and everything could change between now and when we hit the track. So that'll be one of the first things that we do. We'll make sure our shoes are adjusted properly. We did also go ahead and pull our drive shaft out. Obviously there's a bit of wear from it rubbing on the car in some spots, but we're gonna go ahead and get this taken up to our local drive shaft shop, make sure it's still within balance, and make sure our U-joints are still good, have them rebuilt if necessary. And then we'll obviously re-grease and replace the bolts that held it both into our front yoke collar here and the piece on the rear end. We want to make sure we replace those bolts and lock washers because we don't want them to come loose while we're on the track and run into the issue we did last year. So definitely getting it done for the peace of mind. Hopefully when it warms up, we're able to kind of go through and clean up our radiator, but it's not really a high priority. I'm pretty sure once everything warms up, we'll be able to get everything reattached and get water running through it again and observe no leaks. And obviously we'll replace the spark plugs and get our air box here cleaned out well before we need to fire it up at the track. So definitely still a couple things we need to look forward to, but for the most part that pretty much covers all of our teardown on this car. We do have a schedule out from our local track and we're coming through it to make sure that we can actually make all the dates and arrange everything we need to arrange to make sure that we can make it. And I think for our own peace of mind, we'll probably go through and replace every bolt in here, as well as more than likely order a new seatbelt for us, because we know that this one's good enough until 2025, but we tend to get ourselves in and out of the car, and the current straps we have are pulled down to tighten on the lap belts, and the belts that we ran last year in our 1250 car that ended up going with the car were pull-up belts. So I think we're gonna go with that style again, since it is a little bit easier to do when you're trying to get yourself in the car. But our season here will start sooner than we realize, and I'm sure that we'll run out of time to do everything that we want to do when it comes to putting the car back together. It'll probably be a rush job like it was last year, and we'll more than likely mess something up again, but we're gonna do our best to get it back together here pretty quickly, make sure we get everything ordered here in the next couple weeks. And like I said, I hope we don't have to pull anything of the motor out or any of the wiring out. We're just hoping that once everything's back together, it just fires up and it's ready to go, and we'll do our shakedown and then go to our first race. But 9 times out of 10, it's never gonna be that simple. So we're definitely gonna keep our eyes peeled for things we may have missed and hopefully correct it before we go out. But sometimes you can't catch everything, and you just gotta learn from your mistakes. But that's pretty much all I wanted to do today. We're gonna wrap it up here. Hopefully we can get some warmer weather here so we can start getting the car back together and I can spend a little more time out here. But as for now, that's all I've got for you. I appreciate you guys watching. Hope to catch you in the next one.
I can't seem to focus good enough. Nothing's really clear. Sometimes it could be a little tough. I just need to feel like the end's in sight for me. But let's be really real, anxiety can foggy all this stuff.